At my son's wedding, his bride pushed my wife into the mud in front of 300 guests. My son put his arm around her and whispered something that made her laugh. I simply walked to the microphone and said something no one in that room was expecting. Her own father set down his champagne glass. The band stopped playing. I am Warren Becker, 67 years old, and before I tell you exactly what I said to ruin my son's perfect day, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an arrogant child a lesson they will never forget. The afternoon air was thick with humidity and the smell of expensive catering. The Gallagher estate was sprawling, a perfect backdrop for the illusion of wealth that my new daughter-in-law Brittany demanded for her special day. A brief summer storm had just passed, leaving the stone patio slick and the manicured lawn soft and muddy. Diane, my wife of 40 years, was navigating her way through the crowd of laughing, drinking guests. She looked beautiful in her modest silver dress. She was carrying a plate of appetizers to Aaron, our son, who was holding court near the edge of the patio with Brittany. The string quartet was playing a soft melody. Everything seemed picture perfect until Diane took a slight step backward to let a waiter pass. The heel of her shoe caught the very edge of Brittany's extravagant, custom-designed train. It was an accident, a simple, harmless misstep. Diane immediately turned around, her face pale with apology, reaching out her hand to steady herself and apologize. Brittany did not accept the apology. Instead, with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, she shoved my wife hard. Diane lost her footing on the slick stone. She fell backward, tumbling off the patio edge and crashing directly into the thick, dark mud. The sound of my wife hitting the ground cut through the chatter. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of 300 people. I froze my coffee cup halfway to my mouth. I waited for my son, the boy we had raised with every ounce of our love and resources, to rush forward. I waited for Aaron to help his mother up, to scold his new bride for putting her hands on a 65-year-old woman. Instead, Aaron looked down at his mother sitting in the mud. He then wrapped his arm around Brittany's waist, leaned into her ear, and chuckled. He actually laughed. The blood roaring in my ears drowned out the string quartet. I did not yell. I did not cause a physical scene. I set my cup down on a passing waiter's tray and walked through the parted crowd. People stepped aside, their eyes darting between me and the muddy ruin of my wife's silver dress. I knelt beside Diane. Her eyes were welling with tears of profound humiliation. Her silver dress was ruined, soaked through with brown sludge. I took my handkerchief from my pocket and gently wiped the mud from her cheek. I helped her to her feet, kissed her forehead, and whispered for her to wait by the car. Then I turned my attention to the stage. I walked with a steady, measured pace. Brittany was busy inspecting the hem of her pristine white gown, complaining loudly to her bridesmaids about the smudge my wife had supposedly caused. Aaron was still grinning, holding a glass of champagne. I climbed the 3 steps to the stage. The band leader, seeing the look on my face, stopped conducting. The music died instantly. I reached out and took the microphone from the stand. The feedback whined sharply, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. 300 faces turned toward me. Vincent Gallagher, Brittany's father, stood near the front, his arrogant chest puffed out in his tailored tuxedo. He lowered his champagne flute, a frown creasing his forehead. I looked directly at Aaron. My son. The boy I had protected and provided for his entire life. Aaron, I said, my voice echoing off the stone walls of the estate your mother sends, her apologies for dirtying the bride's dress. To make up for the inconvenience, I am announcing my wedding gift right now. Aaron puffed out his chest, a smug smile spreading across his face. He nudged Brittany, expecting a grand gesture, a display of wealth to match the Gallaghers. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the crisp white envelope containing the cashier's check I had prepared that very morning. A check for $150,000, the down payment for their dream home. I held the envelope up so the entire crowd could see it. This envelope, I continued, my voice perfectly level, contains a check for $150,000. It was meant to start your new life. However, seeing as that new life involves putting hands on the woman who gave you life, I am officially canceling this check. Effective immediately. I tore the envelope in half right there on the microphone. The tearing sound was magnified, loud, and final. Then I tore it again. I let the pieces fall like snow onto the polished wooden stage. The silence in that reception was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. Vincent Gallagher's mouth was hanging slightly open. Several bridesmaids covered their mouths in shock. I turned to walk away. I was done. The line had been crossed, and I was cutting the financial cord permanently. But Aaron did not stand there in shame. He did not chase after me to apologize. Instead, he marched up to the stage, his face flushed red with anger. He snatched the microphone from my hand, the feedback screeching again. He sneered at me, his eyes full of venom. "Keep your penny-pinching money, old man," he spat, his voice booming over the speakers. "You think I need your pathetic little savings? Vincent is making me a full partner at Gallagher Imports on Monday. I am stepping into the big leagues. We do not need you or your miserable money anymore. Go home." A smattering of uncomfortable applause came from the Gallagher side of the family. Aaron wrapped his arm triumphantly around Brittany. I did not respond. I simply stepped down from the stage and walked away out of the reception and toward the parking lot where my wife was waiting. But as I walked, my mind was racing. Aaron's arrogant words echoed in my head. Vincent is making me a full partner. My son thought he had just won. He thought he had humiliated me. But there was a massive problem with his triumphant declaration. Aaron believed I was just a mid-level supply chain manager who saved his pennies. He believed Vincent Gallagher was a titan of industry. What Aaron did not know, and what Vincent Gallagher was desperately trying to hide, was that Gallagher Imports had been secretly bankrupt for 3 years. The company was drowning in toxic debt. Vincent did not have 2 dimes to rub together, let alone the capital to make a 32-year-old kid a full partner. Partnerships in corporate structures like that require a massive buy-in, millions of dollars. So as I started the engine of my 10-year-old sedan to drive my muddy, weeping wife home, a chilling question settled in my gut. If Gallagher Imports was bankrupt and my son had no money of his own, how exactly did Aaron buy his way in? What did he trade for that partnership? The answer I was about to uncover would send my own son to federal prison. The drive back to our neighborhood was completely silent. The only sound was the rhythmic beating of the windshield wipers pushing away the summer rain. Diane sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in my suit jacket. She was shivering. The mud had dried into an ugly crust on her skin, and her beautiful silver dress was ruined beyond repair. She stared out the window, refusing to look at me. I knew she was crying quietly. The betrayal of our own son laughing while his wife pushed her into the dirt was a wound that no bandage could fix. I kept my hands firmly gripped on the steering wheel of my 10-year-old sedan. I did not speed. I did not drive erratically. I focused on the road, because if I let my mind linger on the image of Aaron chuckling at his mother, I would have turned the car around and done something I could not take back. We pulled into the driveway of our modest 4-bedroom suburban home. It was the same house Aaron grew up in. The same house where we celebrated his birthdays and helped him with his homework. I walked Diane inside and led her straight to the master bathroom. I ran the warm water and helped her wash the mud out of her hair. She did not say a single word. She simply wept. Once she was clean and dressed in her softest cotton pajamas, I tucked her into bed. I kissed her forehead and promised her everything was going to be all right. I waited until her breathing slowed down and the exhaustion pulled her into a deep sleep. Then I walked down the hall to my home office. I closed the heavy oak door and locked it. I sat at my desk and pulled out my secure phone. I dialed a number I kept memorized. It rang exactly twice before a sharp professional voice answered. It was Pierce. He was my lead corporate attorney, and the man who handled all my sensitive legal affairs. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told Pierce to wake up his best forensic accountants. I needed a complete, silent, and expedited audit of every single financial movement my son had made over the last 6 months. I also needed a full background check on Vincent Gallagher and his import business. Pierce asked if there was a specific problem. I told him my son just claimed he bought a full partnership in a bankrupt company, and I needed to know exactly whose money he used to do it. You see, Aaron lived his entire life believing a very specific narrative about his father. He thought I was just a mid-level supply chain manager who saved his pennies and lived a frugal, boring life. He looked down on our modest house. He rolled his eyes at my 10-year-old car. He thought I was small. He thought I lacked ambition. He constantly compared me to Vincent Gallagher, who drove imported sports cars and wore custom-tailored suits. But Aaron did not understand how real wealth works. Real wealth does not need to show off. Real wealth is silent. The truth that I kept hidden to protect my son from becoming a spoiled, entitled brat was that I never worked in the supply chain department. I owned the entire supply chain. I am the sole owner of a massive holding company that controls the commercial real estate for the entire region. Those warehouses Vincent Gallagher leases for his import business are built on land I own. The shopping centers where Brittany buys her designer clothes belong to my corporate portfolio. I have spent decades building a quiet, invisible empire. I kept my lifestyle simple because I wanted Aaron to learn the value of hard work. I wanted him to earn his own success instead of waiting for a handout. But my plan backfired. My restraint did not make him humble. It made him resentful and vulnerable to the flashy illusions of people like the Gallaghers. I sat in the dark for hours staring at the glowing screen of my computer. I watched the rain beat against the glass window of my office. I went over every interaction I had with Aaron recently, trying to find the missing puzzle piece. Partnerships at a corporate level do not happen with a handshake. They require massive capital, millions of dollars in liquid assets or hard collateral. Aaron earned a decent salary, but he was swimming in credit card debt trying to keep up with Brittany and her luxurious demands. He did not have the cash. He did not have the credit. So how did he buy his way into Vincent Gallagher's company? What leverage did a 32-year-old kid have to offer a desperate, failing businessman? The clock on my desk read 2 a.m. when my secure phone finally buzzed. The bright screen cut through the darkness of the room. I answered immediately. Pierce sounded breathless on the other end of the line. He told me I needed to sit down. I told him I was already sitting and demanded he tell me what his team had found. Pierce explained that Aaron did not use cash to buy his partnership. He used paper. My blood ran cold as Pierce began to lay out the timeline. He told me to think back to exactly 5 weeks ago. 5 weeks ago, Diane was admitted to the local hospital for a minor gallbladder surgery. It was a routine procedure, but she was put on heavy pain medication for a few days to manage the discomfort. I stayed by her side for almost the entire time, but there was one afternoon where I had to step out to meet with a local property manager. I was gone for exactly 2 hours. Aaron had volunteered to sit with his mother while I was away. Pierce's voice grew grim. He explained that during those 2 hours, while Diane was heavily medicated and completely vulnerable, Aaron brought a notary into her hospital room. Aaron presented his mother with a stack of legal documents. He told Diane they were standard medical proxy forms required by the hospital administration. He smiled, held her hand, and told her not to worry about reading the fine print because her eyes were blurry from the medication. He just pointed to the dotted lines and told her where to sign. Diane trusted her son. She signed every single page he put in front of her. She probably smiled at him, thanking him for being such a good boy and taking care of the boring paperwork so his father would not have to worry. The thought of my wife looking up at him with drug-induced hazy affection while he knowingly handed her the instrument of our destruction made me physically sick. But they were not medical proxy forms. Pierce revealed the devastating truth. Aaron had tricked his mother into signing a broad, durable power of attorney. That document gave Aaron absolute and unchecked legal control over Diane's financial assets and property rights. My chest tightened so painfully I could barely breathe. My own son had preyed on his mother while she was lying in a hospital bed, recovering from surgery. I asked Pierce what Aaron did with that document. The answer was a masterclass in betrayal. Pierce told me that Aaron took that fraudulent power of attorney straight to Vincent Gallagher. Aaron used it to sign over the deed to our pristine summer estate, the beautiful lakefront property Diane and I purchased 30 years ago. The place where we spent every July watching the sunsets. The place where Aaron learned how to fish, standing on the wooden dock I built with my own 2 hands. Aaron legally transferred the deed of that property to Vincent Gallagher to use as hard collateral for a massive corporate loan. That was his buy-in. That was how he secured his shiny new partnership. He used our memories and our safe haven to buy a fake title from a fake tycoon. I ended the call with Pierce and placed the phone gently on my desk. The silence of the house felt incredibly heavy. I looked down the hallway toward the master bedroom, where my wife was sleeping, completely unaware that her son had stolen her property while holding her hand in a hospital bed. She was already broken from being shoved into the mud. If she knew the extent of his deception, it would destroy her completely. Aaron thought he had won. He thought his forged paperwork and his arrogant new family had elevated him above his boring, frugal parents. He thought he was untouchable because he believed I was just a tired old man who could not fight back. He did not realize he had just kicked a sleeping giant. He wanted to play high-stakes corporate games using my assets. He wanted to steal the ground out from under us. I opened my encrypted corporate ledger and stared at the vast web of companies under my control. Tomorrow morning, I would not be the quiet supply chain manager anymore. I was going to teach Aaron and his new father-in-law a lesson about real power, and I was going to make sure they lost absolutely everything. I did not throw my coffee mug against the wall. I did not scream into the empty hallway. Anger is a cheap emotion. It makes you sloppy. It makes you loud. And right now, I needed to be entirely silent. I sat in the heavy leather chair of my home office, enveloped in total darkness, save for the harsh blue light of my computer monitors. The rain continued to lash against the glass, but my mind was completely disconnected from the storm outside. I was focused entirely on the digital trail my son had left behind. Aaron thought he was a mastermind playing a high-level corporate game. But he left a digital footprint so wide and reckless, it was almost insulting to look at. I opened my encrypted master ledger. I bypassed 3 distinct security firewalls to access the core banking portal of my holding company. I tapped into the county registry database. It was time to see exactly how deep my son had dug his own grave. The summer estate was the first piece of the puzzle. I pulled up the public property records. There it was. A title transfer executed exactly 2 weeks ago. The forged power of attorney had been scanned and attached to the file. I stared at the digital copy of my wife's signature. The handwriting was shaky, influenced by the heavy painkillers flowing through her veins during her hospital stay. My chest tightened again, but I forced the emotion down. I had to remain clinical. I had to look at this not as a betrayed father, but as the chief executive of an empire under attack. Aaron had signed the property over to a newly formed corporate entity. I ran a quick search on that registry. It was registered to Vincent Gallagher. Aaron had literally handed over a multi-million-dollar lakefront property for absolutely zero financial compensation. It was a blind, desperate gift to win the approval of his arrogant new father-in-law. But as I dug deeper into the commercial registry, I noticed a secondary filing attached to the same corporate profile. My eyes narrowed. You do not file that specific addendum unless you are leveraging the asset. I cross-referenced the company with the commercial loan databases my holding company monitors. A new entry popped up on the screen, and the numbers made my stomach drop. Aaron did not just hand over the deed to the summer house. He used that forged power of attorney to originate a massive commercial loan. Vincent Gallagher had secured $500,000 in liquid cash to inject directly into his failing import business. Aaron was the primary signatory on the loan application. He used his mother's stolen legal authority to underwrite Vincent's bailout. The sheer audacity of the move was staggering. But it was the collateral schedule attached to the bottom of the loan agreement that made my blood freeze. A $500,000 commercial line of credit requires significant backing. The summer house alone was not enough to satisfy the aggressive terms of the bank Vincent had chosen. I scrolled down to the secondary collateral section, my vision blurred for a fraction of a second. There, listed in plain black and white text, was the address of my primary residence. The house I was sitting in at that very moment. The house where my wife was currently sleeping down the hall. Aaron had cross-collateralized our primary home to secure the rest of the funds for Vincent. He put a lien on the roof over his mother's head to buy his way into a fake partnership. If Vincent Gallagher defaulted on this high-interest loan, the bank would not just seize the summer estate. They would foreclose on the house we had lived in for 30 years. My son had legally authorized a bank to throw his parents out onto the street if his new father-in-law failed to make a payment. He had sold our past and our present to buy his own future. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The betrayal was so absolute, so structurally complete, that it almost defied logic. He had left us completely exposed. Now I faced a choice that no father should ever have to make. I looked at the digital copy of the forged power of attorney glowing on my screen. I possessed the legal and financial resources to obliterate that document with a single phone call. I could contact my attorneys and the banking authorities right now. I could file an immediate fraud injunction. The legal mechanism was incredibly simple. The moment I declared the document a forgery, the bank's automated compliance protocols would trigger. The $500,000 loan would be recalled instantly. Vincent Gallagher's company would be thrown into immediate receivership, and his entire pathetic empire would collapse before the sun came up. He would be bankrupt and ruined. But destroying Vincent was the easy part. The real problem was the criminal liability. The bank would demand a scapegoat for the fraudulent loan origination. The signature on the commercial application did not belong to Vincent. It belonged to Aaron. My son was the one who presented the forged document across state lines to secure the funds. He committed wire fraud. He committed grand larceny. He committed severe elder financial abuse against his own mother. These were not civil disputes that could be settled with a fine. These were federal felonies with mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. If I voided that power of attorney tonight, the federal authorities would take jurisdiction of the case by tomorrow afternoon. Aaron would be looking at 15 years in a federal penitentiary. 15 years locked in a cage. His new marriage would dissolve. His reputation would be permanently destroyed. His entire life would be over before his 33rd birthday. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the window. I watched the rain wash over the dark street outside. I thought about the little boy who used to sit on my lap and help me steer the car into the driveway. I thought about the teenager I had proudly watched graduate from high school. I thought about the man who just hours ago had stood on a stage and laughed while his new bride shoved his mother into the mud. He had told me to go home. He had told me he did not need my miserable money anymore. He had chosen his side. He had chosen greed over loyalty. He had chosen arrogance over respect. If I stayed silent, I would be allowing a thief to steal my wife's security. I would be enabling a predator. Aaron believed I was weak. He believed I would simply roll over and accept the humiliation because I loved him too much to fight back. He relied on my paternal instinct to shield him from the consequences of his own horrific actions. But a father's job is not to protect a son from the reality of the world. A father's job is to teach him that every action has a price. Aaron had written a check with his arrogance that his reality could not cash. I walked back to my desk and looked at the glowing monitors. I did not make the phone call to the bank. I did not trigger the immediate fraud alert. I was not going to give them the mercy of a quick death. I was going to let them walk right into the trap they had built for me. I closed the ledger and shut down the computer. The silent audit was complete. It was time to prepare for the eviction. The morning sun cuts through the living room blinds with a harsh and unforgiving light. The storm from yesterday has completely passed, leaving the suburban streets outside quiet and washed clean. I am standing in the kitchen holding a mug of black coffee. I have not slept a single second. I spent the entire night sitting in my dark office tracing the digital footprints of my son's massive betrayal. Down the hallway, the house is completely silent. Diane is still asleep in the master bedroom. I made sure she took a mild sedative to help her rest after the profound humiliation she endured at the wedding reception. The silver dress she wore yesterday is currently sitting in a black garbage bag by the back door. It is a ruined, mud-stained symbol of the exact moment I lost my son forever. A sudden loud knocking echoes through the quiet house. It is not a polite knock. It is the heavy, entitled pounding of someone who believes they own the door they are hitting. I set my coffee mug on the granite counter and walk slowly toward the foyer. A tiny, foolish part of my fatherly heart hopes that Aaron has come to his senses overnight. I hope he is standing on the porch ready to drop to his knees and beg his mother for forgiveness for laughing while his new bride shoved her into the dirt. I unlock the deadbolt and pull open the heavy wooden door. Aaron and Brittany are standing on my front porch. They do not look like newlyweds who just woke up on the first day of their honeymoon. They look like corporate raiders arriving to collect a debt. Brittany is wearing a designer tracksuit and oversized dark sunglasses that cover half her face. She is chewing gum with a slow, arrogant rhythm, completely unfazed by the damage she caused yesterday. Aaron is wearing a tailored blazer over a crisp, casual shirt. He does not look at the ground in shame. He looks me right in the eye, and his posture is dripping with unearned superiority. He does not ask how his mother is doing. He does not offer a single word of apology for the horrific scene at the estate. Instead, Brittany steps forward and shoves a thick manila folder directly into my chest. I have to bring my hands up quickly to catch it before it hits the porch floor. I open the folder. The official embossed seal of the county court glares back at me. It is a formal, legally binding 30-day eviction notice. The document demands that Warren and Diane Becker vacate the premises immediately, citing a transfer of ownership deed that was executed just days ago. I stare at the bold black letters at the top of the page. It is a cold, clinical demand to abandon my entire life. I look up from the papers. Aaron crosses his arms and leans casually against the brick column of the porch. He speaks to me with a voice so cold and calculated it makes my blood run, freezing through my veins. He tells me that the house is no longer mine. He explains that under his new partnership agreement, the property has been fully collateralized under the Gallagher corporate umbrella. He says Vincent Gallagher needs to liquidate this asset immediately to fund their upcoming business ventures and to support the new luxury lifestyle Aaron and Brittany require. He speaks about my home of 30 years as if it is a discarded piece of trash. This is the house where I taught him how to ride a bicycle in the driveway. This is the house where his mother stayed up until 3 a.m, helping him build science projects for school. Now he calls it a liquid asset. He tells me they are putting the house on the market next week, and that I need to have all our cheap, outdated furniture cleared out before the real estate photographers arrive. He says the neighborhood is starting to look a little pathetic anyway, and the property value is only good for a quick cash sale. Brittany reaches into her expensive leather handbag. She pulls out a glossy trifold brochure and flicks it toward me. It flutters through the air and lands on the entryway table inside the house. I look down at it. It is a pamphlet for a state-run retirement facility located on the poorest side of the county. The cover features a depressing stock photo of elderly people sitting in a sterile room. It is a place notoriously known for cramped shared rooms, underpaid medical staff, and the constant suffocating smell of bleach. Aaron gestures towards the brochure. He tells me it is the best they could do on such short notice. He says I should be extremely grateful they even took the time to look for a place for us to go. He looks around my modest foyer with utter disgust and tells me I can use my pathetic supply chain manager pension to cover the monthly fees at the facility. He tells me that since Diane is already starting to slow down and making a fool of herself at public events, it is the perfect place to lock her away so she does not cause any more embarrassing accidents. The cruelty in his voice is absolute. He is actively enjoying the process of stripping away his parents' dignity. My heart beats with a slow, steady, and terrifying rhythm. I force my breathing to remain perfectly controlled. I look at the eviction notice in my hand. I look at the humiliating brochure on the table. I look at my son. The boy I protected from every single hardship in the world is standing on my porch grinning like a predator who just conquered a weak and helpless prey. This was his final test, and he has failed it spectacularly. The boy I loved is entirely gone. Only a greedy, arrogant stranger remains in his place. Brittany smirks and adjusts her sunglasses. She taps Aaron on the arm and tells him they need to leave because they have a first-class flight to catch for their tropical honeymoon. She says they cannot waste another minute breathing the air in this depressing neighborhood, and she wants to be sipping champagne over the ocean by noon. I do not shout at them. I do not tear up the eviction notice and throw it in their faces. I do not break down in tears and beg my son to reconsider. I do not tell them about the federal wire fraud they just committed by forging Diane's signature on the medical proxies. I simply fold the legal document neatly and slide it back into the manila folder. I look Aaron dead in the eye, keeping my voice perfectly quiet and perfectly level. I tell him I will pack. Aaron lets out a loud, triumphant laugh. The sound echoes down the quiet suburban street. He wraps his arm around Brittany's waist and pulls her close. They turn around and walk down the driveway toward their leased luxury sport utility vehicle. They are laughing and whispering to each other the entire way. They think they have completely destroyed the old man. They think they have outsmarted me, forced me into submission, and seized a valuable piece of an empire. I stand in the doorway and watch them get into their car. They drive away without looking back, completely unaware of the absolute devastation they have just unleashed upon themselves. Aaron thinks he is a genius businessman executing a hostile corporate takeover. He thinks he just seized a free and clear asset to impress his arrogant father-in-law. He does not know that by claiming legal ownership of this specific property and initiating a formal eviction, he just stepped directly onto a massive, hidden financial landmine. He just legally bound himself and the entire Gallagher corporate structure to a trap I set 15 years ago. They think they are sending me to a nursing home, but they are walking blindly into their own total destruction. I did not waste time looking back. I walked into the master bedroom where Diane was sitting on the edge of the mattress. She looked incredibly small, holding a single framed photograph of Aaron from when he was 10 years old. I gently took the frame from her hands and placed it face down on the nightstand. I told her we only needed to pack 2 suitcases. We would take just the absolute essentials and enough clothes for a few weeks. She looked at me with red, swollen eyes, asking where we were going to go. She asked if we really had to move into the horrible state-run facility Aaron had shoved in our faces. I smiled a soft, genuine smile for the first time in 2 days. I kissed her forehead and told her we were going somewhere much better. We walked out the front door of the house we had lived in for 3 decades. I did not lock the deadbolt. Aaron owned the house now. Let him worry about the security. I drove us away from the quiet suburban streets and headed straight toward the glittering skyline of the city. Diane remained silent in the passenger seat, watching the familiar neighborhoods fade away into the distance. When I pulled into the private underground parking garage of the tallest residential tower in the financial district, she finally looked at me with deep confusion. A valet in a crisp uniform immediately opened her door, addressing me by name with utmost respect. I led my wife into a private elevator that required a biometric scan to operate. The polished steel doors opened directly into a sprawling 6,000-square-foot penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the entire city skyline. The floors were pristine imported marble, and the kitchen was larger than our entire old suburban house. Diane dropped her purse on the floor. She asked me whose house this was and what we were doing here. I took her hands in mine and told her the truth I had kept hidden for her protection and for our son's character. I told her the house belonged to a blind trust. I told her the blind trust belonged to me. I guided her to a plush velvet sofa overlooking the city lights. I explained that I was never a mid-level supply chain manager. I explained that over the last 40 years, I had built a massive holding company that owned the very commercial buildings we were looking at through the glass. I told her I kept our lives simple because I wanted our son to grow up grounded and humble. I wanted him to understand the value of a hard-earned dollar instead of becoming an entitled heir waiting for a massive payout. Diane listened with wide eyes as the reality of our true situation washed over her. The tears of humiliation she had been crying for 2 days were slowly replaced by profound shock. She realized we were not destitute. She realized we were not at the mercy of our arrogant son and his greedy new family. We were entirely untouchable. I poured her a glass of sparkling water and told her to rest. I had to make a phone call to finalize the transfer of our old property. I stepped into the penthouse study. The room was soundproof and lined with dark wood shelves filled with legal volumes. I sat at the massive glass desk and looked out over the empire I had quietly built from nothing. It was time to spring the trap Aaron had so eagerly walked into. 15 years ago, my corporate accountants advised me to structure my personal assets to minimize legal liability. I placed my primary suburban residence under a very specific financial umbrella. I intentionally attached a highly toxic balloon mortgage to the property using one of my own corporate subsidiaries as the lender. It was a brilliant corporate tax shield designed to protect my assets from outside litigation. The terms of this specific mortgage were utterly predatory. It carried an exorbitant interest rate and featured a brutal acceleration clause. As long as the deed remained in my name, the mortgage was completely harmless. I was essentially borrowing money from myself to keep the house untouchable. I never had to make a payment because the debt simply sat dormant on my own private ledgers. But the acceleration clause was designed with a very specific trigger to destroy anyone who tried to take the property from me. If the deed of the house was ever transferred, sold, or seized by another party without the explicit written consent of the lending company, the entire balance of the mortgage became due immediately. Not in 30 days, not in a week. Immediately. Aaron thought he was a genius when he used the forged medical proxy to transfer the deed of my house to Vincent Gallagher. He thought he was handing his new father-in-law a free and clear asset to use as collateral for his failing import business. He did not bother to run a deep title search. He did not hire competent corporate lawyers to vet the property. He was too arrogant and too eager to prove his worth to the Gallagher family. By legally claiming ownership of the house through the forged power of attorney, Aaron and Vincent triggered the acceleration clause. They did not just steal a piece of suburban real estate. They unwittingly assumed total legal responsibility for a massive toxic debt. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Pierce. My lead attorney answered on the first ring, knowing I would be calling him tonight. I kept my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any paternal hesitation. I asked Pierce if the county clerk had officially processed the deed transfer that Aaron submitted. Pierce confirmed that the paperwork had been stamped and finalized an hour ago. Vincent Gallagher was now the legal owner of record for my old suburban house. I smiled a cold, hard smile in the empty study. I told Pierce to execute the collection protocol on the balloon mortgage. By transferring the deed, Aaron and Vincent had just triggered an immediate repayment demand of $2.5 million. The money was owed directly to my holding company, and it was due by the close of business tomorrow. Pierce paused for a fraction of a second on the other end of the line. He reminded me that Vincent Gallagher did not have $2.5 million in liquid assets. He reminded me that Vincent was already drowning in corporate debt from his failing warehouses and could barely afford his own payroll. I told Pierce that was exactly the point of the trap. When Vincent fails to produce the $2.5 million by tomorrow afternoon, our holding company will have the legal right to seize his business accounts. We will freeze his operating capital. We will force him into involuntary bankruptcy and dismantle his import business piece by piece. Pierce understood the assignment perfectly. But before he hung up, he asked me one final crucial question. He reminded me that Aaron's name was all over the fraudulent transfer documents. When the financial authorities start investigating this massive default, they will easily trace the forged signatures back to my son. Aaron will face 15 years in federal prison for wire fraud and elder abuse. Pierce asked me if I was absolutely sure I wanted to send my own flesh and blood to a federal penitentiary. I looked out the window at the sprawling city below. I thought about Aaron laughing in the rain as his mother fell into the mud. I told Pierce to initiate the collection process. 4,000 miles away, the tropical sun was beating down on the crystal-clear waters of Bora Bora. I knew exactly what the weather was like because my daughter-in-law was documenting every single second of their extravagant honeymoon for the entire world to see. I sat at the massive glass desk in my penthouse study, watching her social media feed update in real time on my tablet. Brittany was posting videos of herself holding crystal flutes of imported champagne on the deck of an overwater bungalow. She wore designer sunglasses and a massive sun hat, laughing carelessly into the camera. Aaron occasionally stepped into the frame wearing expensive linen shirts and a gold watch he had undoubtedly purchased on credit. They looked like royalty. They looked like a power couple enjoying the fruits of their immense success. They were busy selling an illusion of limitless wealth to their friends and followers, completely oblivious to the fact that their financial oxygen had just been cut off at the source. I poured myself a simple cup of black coffee and watched the digital charade play out. Aaron thought he had escaped the consequences of his actions by flying across an ocean. He believed that the forged documents and the stolen house were firmly in his rearview mirror. He assumed Vincent Gallagher was handling the boring corporate paperwork back home while he enjoyed the perks of his new stolen partnership. But Aaron did not understand the sheer speed at which a corporate guillotine falls. By the time he ordered his third bottle of premium champagne on the beach, the $2.5 million demand from my holding company had already hit Vincent Gallagher's desk. Vincent had 24 hours to produce the liquid cash. Of course, Vincent did not have the money. He was a fraud living on borrowed time and leased warehouse space. When Vincent inevitably defaulted on the demand, my legal team executed the prearranged injunction. We initiated a hard freeze on every single bank account, credit line, and corporate card associated with the entire Gallagher enterprise. I knew the exact moment the freeze took effect. My tablet refreshed, showing a new photo of Aaron standing proudly in front of a massive luxury yacht. The caption mentioned a private $10,000 sunset cruise they had chartered for the evening. I took a sip of my coffee and waited. I knew exactly how this scene was playing out on that tropical dock. I could picture Aaron pulling out his heavy metal Gallagher corporate credit card with a smug smile ready to pay the charter captain. I could imagine the slight frown on the captain's face when the portable card reader beeped and flashed a bright red declined message. Aaron would undoubtedly chuckle, blame it on an international security block, and hand over a second platinum card. That one would be declined too. Then he would try his personal cards, the ones that were already maxed out from paying for his tailored wedding suits and first-class flight upgrades. Those would also fail. In a matter of seconds, my arrogant son would go from acting like a corporate titan to standing on a wooden dock with absolutely zero purchasing power. The humiliation would not end at the marina. I knew they would be forced to walk back to their luxury resort completely empty-handed. Once they arrived at the lobby, the hotel management would pull them aside. The resort would have tried to run the daily authorization on the card Aaron left on file for incidentals, and it would have bounced. I could visualize Aaron pacing the bamboo floors of the lobby, demanding that the concierge try the numbers again, screaming that he was a partner at a massive import company. He was stranded on an island paradise with a wife who expected endless luxury, and he did not have a single working piece of plastic in his wallet. The silence in my study was broken by the sharp buzzing of my secure phone. The screen illuminated, displaying an international incoming number. It was Aaron. It was a testament to his sheer arrogance that his first instinct was to call the father he had just evicted. He did not call to apologize. He called because he was looking for someone to blame. Before I answered, I reached across my desk and activated a high-definition audio recording device. In this state, I am legally permitted to record my own phone conversations, and I needed every single word of this call captured with absolute clarity. I pressed the green button on the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply waited for him to speak. His voice came through the speaker, completely stripped of the confident swagger he had displayed on my front porch. He was breathing heavily, his words tumbling out in a panicked, frantic rush. He demanded to know what was happening. He yelled that his cards were being declined everywhere and that hotel management was threatening to lock them out of their bungalow if they did not provide a valid form of payment immediately. He told me he had finally managed to reach Vincent on the phone and that Vincent was screaming about a $2.5 million demand tied to the suburban house. Aaron was furious. He accused me of sabotaging his deal. He actually had the audacity to blame me for ruining his honeymoon. He yelled that I must have called the bank out of spite and lied to them about the property value to trigger a malicious freeze. I kept my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion. I told him I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. I reminded him that he was the one who handed me an eviction notice and claimed legal ownership of the property. I spoke to him as if he were a confused child. I asked him how a simple supply chain manager like myself could possibly trigger a multi-million-dollar bank demand against an untouchable titan like Vincent Gallagher. My calm tone infuriated him even more. He was desperate to prove he was smarter than me. He needed to assert his dominance to convince himself that he was still in control of the situation. He began to brag loudly and aggressively about how easily he had outsmarted me. He wanted to hurt me, so he decided to brag about exactly how he stole my house. He yelled into the phone that I was a pathetic old fool who did not understand how corporate leverage worked. I asked him softly how he managed to get the deed in the first place, since Diane and I never agreed to sell the home. That was the bait, and Aaron swallowed it whole. He laughed a cruel, desperate laugh. He proudly declared that he did not need our permission. He boasted about bringing the notary into his mother's hospital room. He bragged about how easy it was to slip the durable power of attorney into a stack of boring medical proxy forms while she was swimming in heavy painkillers. He explicitly stated that his mother was too drugged to even read the headers on the paperwork, and that he simply pointed to the dotted line and told her to sign. He proudly admitted that he used that specific document to transfer the deed to Vincent Gallagher behind my back to secure his corporate partnership. He thought he was explaining a brilliant business maneuver to a foolish old man. He thought he was proving his superiority. He did not realize he was delivering a flawless, detailed, and entirely voluntary criminal confession directly into a federal recording device. He gave me the exact date, the location, the method of deception, and his explicit intent to defraud his own mother. He outlined every single element necessary to secure a conviction for felony wire fraud and severe elder financial abuse. He handed me the very weapon I would use to destroy his entire life. I let him finish his arrogant rant. I let him breathe heavily into the phone, waiting for my devastated reaction. He expected me to cry. He expected me to yell or curse at him. He expected me to beg him to reconsider what he had done. Instead, I simply told him to enjoy the rest of his honeymoon because the weather back home was about to get incredibly severe. I did not wait for his response. I disconnected the call. I immediately stopped the recording device and extracted the digital audio file. I played the file back through the speakers in my study. Aaron's cruel voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls, perfectly clear and utterly damning. I leaned back in my leather chair, and looked out the window at the sprawling city. I felt a profound sense of finality settle over me. Any lingering doubts I had about destroying my son's future completely vanished the moment he bragged about manipulating his drugged mother. He had crossed a boundary from which there was absolutely no return. I opened a secure email client and attached the audio file. I did not send it to Vincent Gallagher. I did not send it to Brittany. I sent it directly to Pierce with a single line of instruction. I told Pierce to prepare the federal dossier. The first offensive strike was complete. The financial bleeding had begun. Now it was time to let the infection spread to the rest of the Gallagher empire and watch them tear each other apart in their desperation to survive. The morning sun glared off the polished hood of Vincent Gallagher's imported sports car as he drove down the highway toward the industrial district. He gripped the leather steering wheel, feeling like an absolute king. The wedding weekend had been a spectacular triumph of smoke and mirrors. He had successfully projected the image of a billionaire tycoon to hundreds of wealthy guests. He had watched his daughter Brittany marry a young man who was eager to please and easily manipulated. More importantly, he had secured the deed to a valuable piece of suburban real estate without spending a single dime of his own money. Vincent felt completely untouchable. He believed he had outsmarted everyone. He turned up the volume on the classical music playing through his premium car speakers, letting the triumphant symphony wash over him. He was ready to start the work week feeling victorious and recharged. He steered his car off the highway and took the familiar exit toward his flagship commercial property. Vincent operated his entire import business out of 3 massive connecting warehouses in the busiest logistics hub in the county. The sprawling steel buildings were the beating heart of his operation. Every single piece of imported inventory, every delivery truck, and every corporate server was housed behind those high chain-link fences. But as he turned the corner onto his private access road, the triumphant music in his car felt suddenly out of place. He noticed the eerie silence immediately. There were no heavy diesel engines idling by the loading docks. There were no forklifts backing up with their familiar warning beeps. The massive metal loading bay doors were all rolled tightly shut. Vincent slowed his car to a crawl as he approached the main entrance. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the warehouse walls. 4 law enforcement vehicles were parked diagonally across the entrance ramps, forming a solid blockade. Federal marshals wearing dark tactical vests were standing side by side in front of the main gate. A team of private security contractors in high-visibility jackets was currently wrapping thick, heavy chains around the iron bars of the gate. Vincent slammed on his brakes. He threw his car into park and leaped out, leaving the engine running and the door wide open. His face flushed bright red with indignant rage. He marched up to the closest federal marshal, demanding to know what they were doing on his property. He puffed out his chest and used the loud, arrogant tone he usually reserved for intimidating his underpaid employees. The marshal did not flinch. He did not look intimidated. He simply looked at Vincent with mild pity and handed him a thick stack of legal documents attached to a heavy clipboard. The marshal informed him that they were executing a federal commercial lockout order. He stated that the property did not belong to Vincent Gallagher, and his access rights had been officially revoked. Vincent snatched the clipboard and stared at the bold black letters printed at the top of the page. The document was an immediate eviction and asset seizure notice issued by the parent company that owned the industrial park. The company was named Apex Holdings. A cold knot of pure panic began to form in Vincent's stomach as he read the fine print. His entire business model operated on commercial leases. He did not actually own the ground his empire was built upon. For the past 2 months, he had intentionally ignored the rent notices from his landlord. He had quietly diverted hundreds of thousands of dollars from his operational budget to pay for Brittany's extravagant wedding catering and imported floral arrangements. He needed to maintain the illusion of massive wealth to impress the high society guests. He assumed Apex Holdings was just a slow-moving, faceless corporate bureaucracy. He figured he could ignore their automated warning letters and just pay the late fees whenever his next shipping container arrived. He believed he was too important of a tenant to face any real consequences. He assumed completely wrong. Apex Holdings did not send another warning letter. They invoked a zero-tolerance commercial eviction clause that was buried deep within the original lease agreement. The marshals explained the brutal reality of his situation with clinical precision. They told Vincent that the lockout was absolute and comprehensive. Every single physical asset inside those 3 massive warehouses was now legally seized by the landlord to cover the defaulted rent and the breach of contract penalties. His entire inventory of imported goods was locked inside. His fleet of delivery trucks was impounded behind the chained gates. His computer servers containing all his client data and financial records were completely inaccessible. He could not fulfill a single order. He could not ship a single product. He could not even access his own office to retrieve his personal files. His entire company had been decapitated in a single morning. Vincent turned around and looked down the sidewalk. His warehouse managers and administrative staff were standing on the curb, holding cardboard boxes filled with their personal belongings. They had been escorted out of the building by armed security before Vincent even arrived. They looked at him with a mixture of anger and profound betrayal. He was their boss, and he had failed them completely. He watched as a contractor snapped a massive steel padlock shut around the main gate securing the heavy chains. The loud metallic click echoed down the empty street. It was the sound of his entire life crumbling to dust. He was standing on the outside of his own empire, looking through the fence at a business he could no longer touch. He retreated to his luxury sports car and slammed the door shut. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely unlock his phone. The confident, arrogant tycoon from 20 minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by a desperate, terrified man watching his world burn. He called his chief financial officer, screaming into the receiver, demanding a solution. The financial officer sounded completely defeated on the other end of the line. He told Vincent that Apex Holdings had moved with a level of speed and aggression he had never seen before in his entire career. They did not just lock the doors to the physical buildings. They had triggered emergency injunctions on the corporate surety bonds. The business was effectively paralyzed on every possible front. Vincent realized he was completely out of options. He was drowning, and he needed a massive bailout immediately. He told his financial officer to find out exactly who was pulling the strings at Apex Holdings. He demanded the name of the chief executive officer. He insisted that if he could just get a face-to-face meeting with the head of the company, he could charm his way out of the crisis. He believed he could negotiate a payment plan. He desperately thought he could use the deed to the suburban house Aaron had just given him as collateral to reopen the warehouse doors. He had absolutely no idea that claiming ownership of that specific house was the exact action that triggered a separate multi-million-dollar penalty. He thought the house was his salvation. He did not know it was the anchor pulling him to the bottom of the ocean. Sitting in his parked car with the federal marshals standing just a few feet away, Vincent began typing a frantic email on his phone. He addressed it to the legal department of Apex Holdings, begging for an audience with the anonymous owner. He threw away all his pride and wrote a message full of desperate pleading. He asked for a 24-hour extension. He used words like mutual partnership and future growth, trying to stroke the ego of the unseen billionaire who had just crushed his company. He promised he could make them whole if they just unlocked the gates. He pressed send and stared at the locked gates of his ruined empire. He waited in the quiet interior of his car, sweating through his expensive tailored shirt. He hoped the mysterious, wealthy owner of Apex Holdings was a reasonable man who would show him some mercy. The ultimate irony of his total destruction was entirely lost on him. He had absolutely no idea that the anonymous billionaire he was currently begging on his knees was the exact same man he had mocked just 2 days ago. He did not know that the man holding the keys to his entire existence was the man whose wife he had watched fall into the mud. Vincent Gallagher was begging Warren Becker to save his life. The flight back from the tropical paradise was an exercise in absolute humiliation, because every single credit card was frozen. Aaron and Brittany were forced to purchase last-minute economy tickets using the remaining balance of a prepaid emergency debit card. They spent 14 hours crammed into middle seats near the rear lavatory, surrounded by crying infants and the smell of stale airplane food. Brittany wore her designer sunglasses the entire flight, hiding her tear-swollen eyes and refusing to speak a single word to her new husband. Aaron stared blankly at the plastic seat back in front of him, sweating profusely in his expensive linen shirt. The arrogant corporate titan, who had just bragged about his vast wealth, was now trapped in the very back of a commercial airliner, desperately trying to figure out how his entire empire had collapsed. They landed in the late afternoon. The summer heat was suffocating and oppressive. Without access to their premium rideshare accounts, they had to wait in a massive line to catch a standard yellow taxi. They rode in heavy silence while the cab driver navigated the busy highway toward the suburban neighborhood. When they finally pulled up to the house Aaron had stolen from his parents, the reality of their situation began to physically manifest. The beautifully manicured lawn was already starting to look dry and neglected. Aaron paid the driver with the last of his folded cash and dragged their heavy luxury luggage up the concrete driveway. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The interior of the house was like an oven. The heavy summer air was trapped inside, thick and stagnant. Aaron dropped the suitcases onto the hardwood floor and reached for the thermostat on the wall. He pressed the buttons repeatedly, but the digital screen remained completely blank. He flipped the light switches in the hallway and the living room, but the house remained entirely dark. A deep, creeping dread settled over him. He walked into the kitchen and turned the handle on the stainless steel faucet. A pathetic brown drip fell from the spout, followed by a hollow, hissing sound of empty pipes. The utility companies had not just paused their services. The bank had initiated a hard, physical shutoff. The property was officially marked as a distressed and foreclosed asset. Brittany stood in the center of the stifling living room, holding her expensive handbag against her chest. She looked around the dark, sweltering house and demanded to know what was going on. She told Aaron to call the electric company and pay whatever late fee was holding up the power. Aaron leaned heavily against the granite kitchen counter, wiping beads of sweat from his forehead. He tried to maintain his arrogant facade. He lied directly to her face, claiming his new massive partnership was just experiencing some routine bureaucratic delays, but his voice lacked all conviction. He was a terrified boy pretending to be a man, and his new bride was finally beginning to see straight through the illusion. Before Brittany could interrogate him further, the sound of screeching tires echoed through the quiet suburban street. A sleek black luxury sedan pulled into the driveway, parked at a harsh, aggressive angle. The heavy front door swung open, and Vincent slammed it shut behind him. He did not bother to knock. He stormed right into the stifling dark foyer, and the look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated murder. Vincent looked absolutely terrible. His custom-tailored suit was deeply wrinkled, and his tie was pulled loose around his neck. The polished, wealthy tycoon who had so proudly hosted a 300-person wedding reception was entirely gone. In his place stood a desperate, bankrupt man whose entire life had just been locked behind federal chains. Vincent completely ignored his daughter and marched straight toward Aaron in the kitchen. He pointed a shaking finger at his son-in-law and demanded to know exactly what kind of toxic garbage asset Aaron had handed him. Vincent screamed that his entire import business was padlocked by federal marshals because the anonymous landlord had executed an immediate commercial lockout. But that was not the worst part. Vincent revealed the catastrophic, fatal error Aaron had made. Vincent yelled that by accepting the deed to this specific suburban house, they had triggered a hidden corporate balloon mortgage. He told Aaron that the bank was currently demanding an immediate repayment of $2.5 million. Vincent slammed his fists on the granite counter, demanding that Aaron use his supposed vast personal wealth to fix the massive debt he had just triggered. Aaron backed away, his eyes wide with profound shock. He realized then that his father had set a flawless, invisible trap. But instead of taking responsibility, Aaron did what he had always done. He deflected the blame. He yelled right back at Vincent. He demanded that Vincent pay him the massive partnership salary he was promised at the wedding. Aaron screamed that his own credit cards were declining and he needed his executive signing bonus immediately to clear his mounting personal debts. He told Vincent to liquidate the import warehouses to cover the $2.5 million. It was a pathetic display of ignorance. Aaron still did not understand that the warehouses were entirely leased and that Vincent did not actually own any of the commercial property he operated on. Brittany watched the two men screaming at each other in the dark, suffocating kitchen. The pieces of the puzzle rapidly assembled in her mind. She looked at her father, the man she believed to be an untouchable billionaire begging for a bailout. She looked at her new husband, the man she thought was a secret trust fund, baby demanding a salary to pay off basic credit cards. The entire foundation of her marriage crumbled into dust in a matter of seconds. She realized they were all completely broke. She realized there was no corporate empire, no limitless bank accounts, and no glamorous future. She had married a fraud who stole a heavily indebted house from his own parents, and her father had used her wedding to hide his total financial ruin. Brittany let out a shrill, piercing scream that silenced both men. She threw her expensive handbag across the kitchen, where it knocked a glass vase off the counter and shattered it into pieces. She marched up to Aaron and shoved him hard in the chest. She screamed that he was a pathetic, broke liar. She told him he was nothing but a useless supply chain manager's son who had to forge documents just to pretend he was important. She yelled that she had wasted the best years of her life tying herself to a man who could not even keep the lights on in a stolen house. She was no longer the smug bride laughing in the rain. She was a deeply indebted woman trapped in the dark. Vincent watched his daughter attack his son-in-law, and a cold, calculating shift occurred in his eyes. The panic in his expression slowly morphed into a ruthless survival instinct. Vincent was a shark who had spent decades navigating the murky waters of commercial logistics. He knew when a ship was sinking, and he knew exactly how to throw someone overboard to lighten the load. He realized that the $2.5 million debt and the federal lockouts were all legally tied back to the fraudulent deed transfer. He realized that Aaron was the sole source of the toxic infection that had just destroyed the business name. Vincent slowly straightened his posture and buttoned his wrinkled suit jacket. He looked at Aaron with absolute disgust and told him he was a massive liability. Vincent stated very calmly that he was not going to go down for a federal crime committed by a desperate, arrogant kid. He told Aaron that the forged signature on the medical documents belonged entirely to him. Vincent explained his new plan with chilling clarity. He declared he would walk straight into the district attorney's office tomorrow morning. He was going to hand over the fraudulent property deed and swear under oath that Aaron acted completely alone. Vincent was going to trade his new son-in-law to the federal prosecutors in a desperate attempt to secure his own corporate immunity. Aaron stood frozen in the dark kitchen, the realization washing over him like ice water. The father-in-law he had committed profound treason to impress was now going to be the star witness in his federal prosecution. The arrogant alliance was entirely dead, and Aaron was completely alone. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, expensive chime revealing the top floor of the Apex Holdings tower. Vincent adjusted his tie, his hands slick with nervous sweat. He was running on pure adrenaline and desperation, having spent the last 48 hours watching his entire import empire remain locked behind federal chains. He had pulled every string, called every contact, and practically begged the legal department for an emergency audience with the anonymous CEO of this faceless holding company. He needed to unlock those warehouse doors today, or his business was permanently finished. Walking slightly behind him were Aaron and Brittany. Vincent had dragged them along for one specific purpose. He was going to throw his arrogant son-in-law directly under the bus. He planned to present Aaron to the Apex board as a rogue, desperate kid who had forged legal documents without Vincent's knowledge. He was going to use Brittany to play the victim, the innocent bride who had been duped by a fraudulent husband. Vincent believed that if he offered the board a clear scapegoat, they might show him mercy and release the commercial lockout. A severe-looking receptionist escorted them down a wide hallway lined with modern art and frosted glass. Vincent tried to project an air of confident wealth, but his wrinkled suit and exhausted eyes gave him away. He was a man walking to his own execution, hoping he could talk his way out of the noose. Aaron walked with his head bowed, terrified of the federal wire fraud charges hanging over his head. Brittany clutched her designer handbag, glaring at her husband with undisguised hatred. The toxic alliance that had formed at the wedding reception was entirely dead, replaced by a desperate, frantic scramble for individual survival. The receptionist opened a set of heavy mahogany doors, gesturing for them to enter the main boardroom. The room was spectacular. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the entire city skyline, the exact same view I enjoyed every morning from my private office. The conference table was massive, polished to a mirror finish. Several executives in sharp suits sat along the sides, their faces completely unreadable. But it was the chair at the head of the table that drew all the attention. The high-backed leather chair was turned around, facing the sprawling city view, hiding the CEO from sight. Vincent stepped into the room, clearing his throat, trying to summon the arrogant swagger he had used to intimidate so many people. He announced his presence, stating that he was Vincent Gallagher, and he was here to negotiate a mutually beneficial resolution to the unfortunate commercial lockout situation. He spoke loudly, assuming the man in the chair was just another corporate shark he could charm or bribe. The executives at this table did not speak. They did not offer Vincent a seat. They simply waited. The heavy leather chair slowly swiveled around. Vincent stopped talking instantly. His mouth hung slightly open, the arrogant words dying in his throat. Aaron took a sharp, stumbling step backward, actually bumping into the mahogany doorframe. Brittany let out a small, strangled gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. The color drained entirely from their faces, leaving them looking like three ghosts staring at the absolute impossible. I sat at the head of the table wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, my hands folded calmly over a thick leather-bound dossier. I did not look like the tired supply chain manager they had mocked. I did not look like the old man they had tried to evict. I looked exactly like what I was, the chief executive of a multi-billion-dollar empire, and the man who held their entire lives in the palm of his hand. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. You could hear the faint hum of the city traffic far below. Vincent stared at me, his eyes wide with a profound, shattering comprehension. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in his mind with devastating force. The massive commercial lockout, the sudden $2.5 million demand, the perfectly timed financial freeze. It was not a faceless corporate bureaucracy. It was a targeted surgical strike executed by the man he had humiliated just days ago. Aaron looked at me, his entire body trembling. The arrogant son who had laughed while his mother was shoved into the mud was entirely gone. In his place stood a terrified boy who finally realized the true magnitude of his mistake. He had tried to steal a house from a man who owned the city. He had tried to play corporate games with a man who wrote the rules. I let them stand there for a long, agonizing moment, letting the sheer terror of their situation sink deep into their bones. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. True power does not need to shout. I picked up the thick dossier and slid it slowly across the polished mahogany table. The heavy folder stopped exactly in front of Vincent. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice perfectly level, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Welcome to my office, Vincent," I said quietly. "Let's talk about your debt." Vincent reached for the dossier with hands that trembled so violently he could barely lift the heavy leather cover. He flipped it open and stared at the pages inside. I did not need to look at the documents to know exactly what he was seeing. I had personally curated every single piece of paper in that file. The very first page was the master lease agreement for the 3 commercial warehouses that housed Gallagher Imports. I watched his eyes scan the bottom of the page where the parent company signature was required. I told him to look closely at the ink. I told him to recognize the name that had been signing his lease renewals for the past decade. It was my name. I explained that he did not just rent space from a faceless corporate entity. He rented his entire livelihood from me. I owned the concrete his trucks parked on. I owned the steel walls that protected his inventory. And because he decided to finance his daughter's extravagant wedding instead of paying his commercial rent, I now owned every single piece of imported inventory locked inside those buildings. Vincent tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. He swallowed hard, sounding like a man suffocating on his own arrogance. I did not let him catch his breath. I instructed him to turn to the second page. It was the acceleration clause connected to the toxic balloon mortgage. I spoke with a quiet, clinical precision, letting every word land like a physical blow. I explained that when my son handed him the forged deed to my suburban home, Vincent enthusiastically accepted stolen property. By using that stolen deed to secure a commercial bailout loan, he officially tied the Gallagher corporate structure to my hidden financial trap. I told him that the $2.5 million demand was not a clerical error. It was a legally binding execution of debt. I looked at the proud tycoon who had sipped champagne while my wife lay weeping in the dirt. I told him that his company was currently in receivership. His bank accounts were completely frozen. He was officially bankrupt and facing severe federal scrutiny for receiving fraudulent collateral across state lines. The illusion of his vast empire was completely dead. Then I turned my attention to the bride. Brittany stood frozen near the edge of the massive mahogany table. The arrogant smirk she had worn on my front porch when she handed me the eviction notice was entirely gone. She looked like a ghost trapped under the bright fluorescent lights of the boardroom. I slid a separate, much thinner folder across the polished wood directly toward her. I told her to open it. I told her she deserved to see the exact financial portfolio of the man she had married. She hesitated, her manicured fingers shaking as she lifted the cover. I did not wait for her to read it. I recited the numbers from memory so the entire board of executives could hear exactly what kind of fraud was standing in their presence. I detailed Aaron's maxed-out credit cards. I listed the exorbitant personal loans he took out to pay for his tailored suits and his first-class honeymoon to Bora Bora. I explained that Aaron possessed absolutely zero equity in the Gallagher company because his entire partnership buy-in was founded on a forged, stolen, and highly toxic asset. I watched the realization wash over her pale face. She had married a man purely for his supposed wealth and his corporate ambition, only to discover she had tied herself to a completely broke criminal. I looked at her pristine designer outfit and reminded her that every single luxury she was currently wearing was financed by fraudulent debt. I told her that the shoes she had used to push my wife into the mud were bought with stolen money. The atmosphere in this boardroom fractured completely. The reality of their total destruction fell upon them like a collapsing building. Vincent Gallagher, the man who had built his entire identity on dominating others physically, collapsed. His knees hit the carpeted floor with a heavy thud. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, looking up at me with tears streaming down his face. He begged me for a payment plan. He pleaded with me to unlock the warehouse gates, promising he would work the rest of his life to pay off the debt. He offered to sign his entire company over to me if I would just call off the federal marshals and release his inventory. He was weeping openly, stripping away every ounce of his pride. I looked down at him, kneeling exactly where I wanted him, and felt absolutely nothing. He was paying the price for his arrogance. Beside him, the shock in Brittany's eyes morphed into pure, unadulterated rage. She looked at her father begging on his knees and realized her new husband was the sole reason why her entire privileged life was burning to the ground. She turned toward Aaron. She did not yell immediately. She simply raised her hand and delivered a vicious, open-palmed slap directly across his face. The sound cracked through the silent boardroom, perfectly echoing the exact physical violence she had used against my wife at the reception. She screamed that he was a liar. She screamed that he had ruined her life and destroyed her family. She cursed him for pretending to be a wealthy heir when he was nothing but a pathetic thief. Aaron stumbled backward, clutching his red, stinging cheek, completely paralyzed by the collapse of his entire world. The executives at the table watched the scene with cold detachment. Aaron looked around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face and finding only severe judgment. He finally looked away from his furious wife and turned his panicked eyes toward me. The arrogant corporate raider was completely gone. He looked exactly like the terrified little boy who used to break things in the garage and hope I would magically clean up the mess. His chest heaved as he took a step forward, his voice cracking under the massive weight of his total destruction. "Dad," he whispered, his voice echoing in the massive glass room, "how do we fix this?" I sat back in my leather chair and folded my hands over the dossier. I looked at the son who had laughed at his mother's humiliation. I looked at the man who had forged documents while his mother was drugged in a hospital bed. "We do not," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "You evicted me. I am just your landlord now." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Aaron stood there with the red mark of his wife's hand still burning on his cheek. He was waiting for me to throw him a lifeline. He was waiting for the father who had fixed every broken toy and paid for every mistake to somehow wave a magic wand and make the $2.5 million debt disappear. I did not move a single muscle to help him. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a small black digital audio player. I placed it gently on the polished mahogany table right next to the massive dossier of his financial ruin. Vincent was still kneeling on the floor, weeping quietly into his hands. Brittany was breathing heavily, glaring at Aaron with a hatred so pure it practically vibrated in the air. The board executives sat completely still, watching the destruction of a family play out in real time. I looked at Aaron and told him that his biggest mistake was not stealing from me. His biggest mistake was assuming I was stupid. I pressed the play button on the small black device. The audio was crystal clear. It echoed off the floor to ceiling glass windows and filled the massive corporate space. It was the exact recording of the phone call Aaron had made to me from his luxury bungalow in Bora Bora. My calm, steady voice played first, asking him a simple question about how he managed to secure the deed to my house. Then came his reply. Aaron heard his own arrogant voice booming through the boardroom speakers. He heard himself laughing a cruel, mocking laugh. He listened in absolute horror as his recorded voice proudly explained the entire scheme. The recording detailed exactly how he brought the notary into the hospital room. It captured him bragging about slipping the durable power of attorney into a stack of boring medical proxy forms. Everyone in the room heard him explicitly state that his mother was heavily medicated on painkillers and too blurry-eyed to read the headers on the paperwork. His recorded voice boasted about pointing to the dotted line and telling her to sign. Aaron stood frozen in front of the table. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He realized he was listening to his own voluntary criminal confession. Brittany covered her mouth with her hands, taking another step away from him, as if he were carrying a deadly disease. Even Vincent stopped his pathetic weeping and looked up from the carpet, his eyes wide with a new profound level of terror. They all knew exactly what that recording meant. I reached out and pressed the pause button. The sudden silence in the room felt heavier than the audio. I looked directly into my son's terrified eyes. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any lingering trace of parental affection. I told him that he thought he was executing a clever corporate loophole. I explained that what he actually did was commit severe elder financial abuse against a vulnerable patient recovering from surgery. I watched his chest heave as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. I continued my clinical deconstruction of his actions. I told him that when he took that forged document and presented it to a commercial bank to secure a $500,000 loan for Vincent, he committed grand larceny. I explained that because the bank he defrauded was headquartered in another state, and he authorized the electronic transfer of those funds while sitting on a tropical island, he committed federal wire fraud. I saw his knees begin to physically shake. I educated him on the brutal reality of the federal justice system. I told him these were not simple civil disputes that could be settled with a slap on the wrist or a corporate bankruptcy filing. These specific felonies carry mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. There is no parole in the federal system. I told him he was not looking at a financial penalty. He was looking at spending the best years of his life locked inside a concrete cell. Aaron began to shake his head back and forth in slow, desperate denial. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked at the audio player on the table as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. He finally realized the flawless nature of the trap I had set. I had not just let him steal a house. I had given him the rope he needed to hang himself, and then I quietly recorded him kicking away the chair. He fell back into one of the heavy leather boardroom chairs, gripping the armrests with white knuckles. He asked me in a voice that was barely a whisper if I was really going to use that recording to destroy him. I told him he destroyed himself the moment he decided his mother's safety was worth less than a fake corporate title. I told him I was simply the man delivering the receipt for his purchases. Vincent slowly pulled himself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the table. He tried to distance himself from Aaron immediately. Vincent stammered that he had absolutely no idea the power of attorney was forged. He claimed he was an innocent victim of Aaron's deception. I looked at Vincent and told him ignorance of a crime does not excuse the possession of stolen assets. I reminded him that he eagerly accepted a multi-million-dollar property without a single question because his greed completely blinded his judgment. He was just as guilty of receiving the fraudulent funds and using them across state lines. The tension in the room reached an absolute breaking point. Aaron was weeping silently, his face buried in his hands, completely broken by the weight of his impending doom. Brittany was completely numb, staring blankly at the polished wood table, realizing her entire future was erased. I sat back in my chair and buttoned my suit jacket. I told them that our meeting was officially concluded. Aaron looked up, his eyes red and swollen. He asked if I was going to call the police. I offered him a very cold, very polite smile. I told him he fundamentally misunderstood how corporate executives handle massive fraud. I do not call the local police. I prefer to utilize specialized professionals. At that exact moment, the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom swung open. Pierce, my lead attorney, walked into the room. He was not carrying his usual leather briefcase. He was holding a single manila envelope. But Pierce did not walk in alone. He was flanked by two tall individuals wearing dark suits and serious expressions. They stepped into the boardroom with a heavy, authoritative presence that instantly commanded the entire room. One of the men reached into his breast pocket and produced a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a shining gold badge. He announced that he was a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The color vanished from Aaron's face for the final time. I looked at my son and explained the final piece of the puzzle. I told him I did not just bring that audio recording to this meeting to watch him squirm. I told him I handed the entire digital dossier, including the financial traces, the forged signatures, and the vocal confession, directly to the federal prosecutor over an hour ago. The trap was not just sprung. The steel jaws had completely snapped shut. The special agent stepped forward. His polished shoes made no sound on the thick carpet of the boardroom. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The badge in his hand held all the authority in the world. He looked directly at Aaron and stated his full name. He recited the federal charges with a practiced robotic efficiency. Wire fraud, grand larceny, elder financial abuse. Every single word hung in the cold air of the glass room like a heavy stone. The second agent walked around the massive mahogany table. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. Aaron took a stumbling step backward. He bumped into the floor-to-ceiling window. He looked like a trapped animal. He raised his hands in front of his chest as if he could physically push the federal charges away. He shook his head frantically. He told the agents there was a mistake. He told them he was a partner in a major import corporation. He pointed a trembling finger at me and yelled that I was just a bitter old man trying to ruin his business deal. The agent did not argue. He simply grabbed Aaron's wrist. He twisted my son's arm behind his back with a swift professional motion. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the silent boardroom was the most definitive sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a life ending. Vincent was still kneeling on the floor. He watched the agents secure his son-in-law. He began to scramble backward across the carpet, like a crab trying to put as much distance between himself and Aaron as possible. Vincent held his hands up in surrender. He stammered that he was completely innocent. He cried that he had been manipulated by a rogue employee. He offered to testify against Aaron in a court of law. He promised to hand over his entire company ledger if they would just let him walk out of the building. The lead agent turned his attention to Vincent. He pulled a second pair of handcuffs from his belt. He looked down at the weeping, ruined tycoon and read a separate list of federal charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, accepting stolen assets across state lines. The agent explained that ignorance is not a valid legal defense when you accept a stolen multi-million-dollar property to secure a fraudulent corporate bailout. The agent hauled Vincent up from the carpet. He roughly secured Vincent's hands behind his back. The proud, arrogant father of the bride was now nothing more than a common federal suspect. He sobbed openly. He begged for his lawyer. He begged for mercy. No one in the room offered him a single ounce of pity. Aaron began to panic. The reality of the cold steel around his wrists finally pierced through his delusion. He realized he was not going to a luxury hotel. He was not going back to his stolen house. He was going to a federal holding cell. He began to hyperventilate. He looked at me with wild, terrified eyes. He begged me to tell the agents to stop. He pleaded with me to call off the lawyers. He promised he would give the house back. He promised he would work for the rest of his life to pay off the debt. He called me Dad over and over again. His voice cracked and broke into high-pitched sobs. I did not move. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair. I watched the consequences of his actions swallow him whole. The heavy wooden doors of the boardroom opened one more time. The room fell entirely silent. Diane walked through the doorway. My wife looked absolutely breathtaking. She was not the humiliated crying woman sitting in the mud at a wedding reception. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that perfectly matched mine. Her silver hair was styled immaculately. Her posture was straight and proud. She possessed the quiet, unshakable dignity of a queen entering her throne room. She walked gracefully to my side and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. She looked at the two handcuffed men standing in the center of our corporate boardroom. Aaron stopped struggling against the federal agents. He looked at his mother. The tears streamed freely down his face. His arrogant facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He reverted instantly to a frightened little boy. He dropped to his knees, pulling the agents down with him. He sobbed and called out to her. He begged her for forgiveness. He told her he was so sorry for everything. He told her he was confused and stressed and desperate. He reminded her of how she used to hold him when he was sick. He reminded her of the science projects and the birthday parties. He weaponized every single maternal memory he could think of, trying to find a weak spot in her armor. He pleaded with her to tell the agents to let him go. He told her he could not survive in a federal prison. Diane looked down at him. Her face betrayed no emotion. She did not yell. She did not cry. She simply listened to his desperate, pathetic apologies. She looked at the son she had raised. She looked at the man who had tricked her into signing away her safe haven while she was swimming in heavy painkillers. Then she shifted her gaze. She looked past Aaron. She looked directly at Brittany. Brittany was standing frozen near the wall. She was trembling in her expensive designer clothes. Diane lowered her eyes and looked specifically at Brittany's shoes. They were the same custom white silk shoes Brittany had worn on her wedding day. The same shoes she was wearing when she violently shoved Diane off the stone patio. Because Aaron and Brittany were entirely bankrupt, because all their credit cards were frozen and their accounts were seized, Brittany had not been able to afford a trip to the dry cleaners. The expensive white silk was still heavily stained with dark, dried mud. The exact same mud Diane had fallen into. Diane stared at the dried mud on those designer shoes. It was the ultimate physical proof of their cruelty and their current pathetic poverty. It was the undeniable reminder of how they had treated her when they thought they held all the power. Diane did not need to say a single word. She lifted her head. She looked at Aaron one final time. Her eyes were completely empty of maternal love. The well of her forgiveness was entirely dry. Diane turned her back on her son. She faced the sprawling windows looking out over the glittering city that we owned. She did not look back. Aaron's screams echoed off the glass walls. He wailed for his mother as the federal agents hauled him to his feet. They dragged him toward the boardroom doors. He thrashed and kicked, but the agents were much stronger. They dragged him down the hallway toward the elevators. Vincent was dragged out right behind him, weeping and apologizing to the empty air. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut, closing off the sound of Aaron's desperate, pathetic cries. The elevator chimed, and then there was nothing but silence. I stood up from my chair. I buttoned my suit jacket and placed my hand gently over Diane's hand. We stood together in the quiet boardroom, completely at peace. The cancer had been cleanly removed from our family. Brittany was left standing entirely alone in the center of the massive glass room. She was not handcuffed. She was not arrested. The federal agents did not care about her because her name was not on the forged documents. But her punishment was far worse than a quick arrest. She stood trembling under the bright fluorescent lights, realizing the absolute totality of her situation. She had married a man purely for his money and his status. She had mistreated everyone who stood in her way. Now she was completely bankrupt. Her credit cards were declined. She had no access to cash. She had been legally evicted from her stolen home. She had no place to sleep tonight. Her father was on his way to a federal holding cell, and her new husband was facing a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. She was left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back and a pair of mud-stained wedding shoes. We did not say a word to her. We simply walked out of the boardroom, leaving her completely alone in the wreckage of her own arrogance. 2 weeks had passed since the heavy mahogany doors of the corporate boardroom slammed shut on my son's arrogant life. The storm of federal indictments, corporate asset seizures, and public humiliation had swept through the city, dominating the local financial news. Diane and I did not watch the broadcasts. We did not need to see the spectacular public ruin of the people who had tried to destroy us. We spent our days in the quiet sanctuary of our penthouse, reclaiming the peace that had been stolen from us over the past few months. The toxic stress that had weighed on my wife was completely gone. Her smiles were genuine again. The shadow of our son's betrayal would always be a part of our history, but it no longer dictated our present. We were moving forward. It was a Tuesday evening, and the city was being battered by a relentless torrential downpour. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, blurring the glowing lights of the financial district into streaks of gold and red. Diane and I had decided to go out for a quiet dinner at a private restaurant across town. We took the biometric elevator down to the secured underground parking garage. The subterranean concrete cavern was perfectly silent and brightly lit by rows of sterile fluorescent tubes. The air smelled faintly of damp pavement and expensive motor oil. I pressed the button on my key fob, and the lights of my luxury sedan flashed in the distance. As we walked toward the vehicle, a small shivering shadow detached itself from the concrete pillar situated right beside my parking space. Diane stopped walking and grabbed my arm. I stepped slightly in front of her, keeping my expression completely neutral, as the figure stepped out into the harsh overhead lighting. It was Brittany. She had somehow managed to bypass the strict security protocols of the building, perhaps by tailgating a delivery truck through the service entrance or slipping through a closing gate. The woman standing before me looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant bride who had worn a custom silk gown and demanded the world bow at her feet. She was entirely unrecognizable. Her clothes were cheap and poorly fitted. She wore a thin, oversized raincoat that was soaked completely through, clinging to her trembling frame. Her hair was matted to her skull by the freezing rain. Her face was pale, gaunt, and entirely devoid of the expensive makeup she used to wear like armor. She stood there, hugging herself to conserve body heat. She looked like a stray dog, completely broken and desperate. The high society friends she used to boast about had clearly abandoned her the exact second her father's bank accounts were frozen by federal marshals. The luxury boutiques and exclusive country clubs had closed their doors to her. She was a woman who had built her entire identity on the illusion of wealth, and without that money, she had simply ceased to exist in the world she once ruled. "Warren, please?" she whispered, her voice cracking and echoing weakly against the concrete walls. She did not use her usual demanding tone. She sounded small and pathetic. She took a hesitant step forward, keeping her eyes fixed on the wet pavement. "I have nowhere else to go." I did not offer her a towel. I did not ask her how she got past the security desk. I simply stood there holding my car keys, waiting for her to explain exactly why she thought she had the right to ambush my wife and me in our private residence. She looked up at Diane with wide, pleading eyes, desperately trying to summon some kind of maternal pity. Diane simply stared back at her with a cold, impenetrable gaze. There was no sympathy left in my wife's heart for the woman who had violently shoved her into the mud. "I did not know," Brittany stammered, pulling her soaked coat tighter around her shoulders. She began to cry, but the tears felt calculated and entirely self-serving. "I did not know what Aaron and my father were planning. They lied to me from the very beginning. They told me Aaron was a wealthy heir. My father forced me into the marriage to secure his business deals. I was just a pawn in their corporate games. They used me, Warren. I am a victim of their manipulation, just like you and Diane." The sheer audacity of her narrative was almost impressive. She was standing in my parking garage, attempting to rewrite the entire history of her own cruelty. She wanted me to believe that she was an innocent bystander who had been swept up in a storm created by greedy men. She was asking me to entirely forget the arrogant smirk she wore when she handed me the legal eviction notice on my own front porch. She wanted me to ignore the fact that she had actively participated in the emotional abuse of my wife. "I need a loan," she blurted out, her voice rising in a frantic rush. "I need to hire a divorce attorney to officially separate myself from your son before his federal trial begins. I need money for a security deposit on a small apartment. Just $10,000, Warren. That is nothing to you. It is pocket change. I will sign whatever contract you want. I will pay you back every single penny with interest once I get back on my feet. Please, I am sleeping in a cheap motel and my money runs out tomorrow." I let her desperate plea hang in the cold, damp air of the garage. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, methodical rhythm, making sure she heard every single syllable clearly over the sound of the rain pouring into the exhaust vents outside. I told her she was a very poor liar. I explained that she was never a victim of manipulation. I reminded her that she eagerly embraced the cruelty because she believed it would finance her luxury lifestyle. I painted a very clear picture of her true character. I told her she shoved my wife into the dirt because she felt untouchable. She handed me an eviction notice because she enjoyed the feeling of crushing someone she believed was weak. She did not care where the money came from, as long as she could charter luxury yachts and drink imported champagne. Her only regret was that she attached herself to a sinking ship. She was not crying because she felt remorse. She was crying because she was finally facing the consequences of her own terrible decisions. Brittany stared at me, her jaw trembling. The victim facade melted away, leaving only pure desperation. "You have millions," she whispered, her voice laced with bitter resentment. "You can ruin my father and send your own son to prison, but you cannot spare a few $1,000s to help a woman you destroyed." "I did not destroy you," I replied calmly. "You destroyed yourself the moment you decided human dignity was less important than a designer label." I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. Brittany's eyes immediately lit up with a pathetic glimmer of hope. She thought my lecture was simply the price she had to pay before I pulled out my checkbook to make her go away. She thought her begging had finally worked. I pulled my hand out of my pocket. I was not holding a checkbook. I was holding a crisp, white, rectangular piece of cardstock. I extended my arm and offered it to her. She took it with shaking fingers, holding it up to the harsh fluorescent light to read the printed text. It was a business card. The bold black letters read Apex Commercial Sanitation Services. That is one of the many subsidiary companies operating under my holding umbrella, I explained, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. They handle the overnight deep cleaning for industrial slaughterhouses and public transit stations. The work is physically agonizing. The shifts begin at midnight and end at dawn. The pay is the absolute legal minimum wage permitted by state law. Brittany looked up from the business card, her eyes wide with profound horror and deeply insulted pride. She opened her mouth to protest, to scream that she was above scrubbing concrete floors in the middle of the night. I cut her off before she could speak a single word. I will not give you a loan, I stated firmly. I will not hand you a single dime of my money to finance a divorce lawyer. But if you call the number on that card tomorrow morning and tell the dispatch manager you are ready to work, they will hand you a mop and a bucket. If you want a roof over your head, you are going to have to earn it with blisters on your hands, just like the rest of the world. I turned my back on her and opened the passenger door of the sedan for my wife. Diane slid into the leather seat without sparing Brittany a second glance. I walked around the vehicle, got into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The powerful motor hummed to life, echoing through the concrete garage. I put the car into gear and slowly pulled out of the parking space. I looked in my rearview mirror one last time. Brittany was standing completely alone under the sterile lights, shivering in her soaked coat. She was staring blankly at the small white business card in her hand. The heavy steel automated security gate rolled open, letting the freezing rain blow into the garage. She had absolutely no choice but to turn around and walk back out into the violent storm, entirely humiliated and completely broke. 6 months passed with the slow, relentless grind of the federal justice system. The seasons changed outside the city, but the massive stone walls of the federal courthouse remained cold and completely unyielding. I sat in the front row of the gallery, with Diane holding her hand firmly in mine. The courtroom was vast, lined with dark polished oak, and filled with an oppressive, heavy silence. The gallery behind us was packed with local journalists, financial reporters, and curious onlookers who had eagerly followed the spectacular public collapse of the Gallagher import business. But I was not looking at the crowd. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the two men sitting at the defense tables. Vincent Gallagher and my son Aaron were wearing identical, loose-fitting orange prison jumpsuits. Their hands and ankles were bound by heavy metal chains that clinked loudly against the wooden chairs whenever they shifted their weight. The physical transformation was absolute and devastating. The custom-tailored suits, the expensive imported watches, and the arrogant smirks they wore at the wedding were completely gone. Vincent looked 20 years older than the last time I saw him in my boardroom. His hair had thinned and turned entirely white, and his shoulders slumped forward as if the gravity of the room was physically crushing him. Aaron looked incredibly pale and hollow. He stared blankly at the scarred wooden table in front of him, his jaw trembling slightly under the harsh fluorescent lights. They were no longer titans of industry or confident corporate raiders. They were just two federal inmates waiting to find out exactly how much of their lives they were about to lose. The heavy wooden door behind the bench opened, and the judge entered the room. Everyone stood in perfect silence. The judge was a stern, meticulous woman with decades of experience handling corporate fraud and elder abuse cases. She did not waste a single second with pleasantries. She opened the thick legal dossier in front of her and looked down at the defendants with absolute open disgust. She spoke with a sharp, clear voice that echoed off the high ceiling. She addressed Vincent first. She dismantled his entire career in a matter of minutes, calling him a desperate predator who built a house of cards and used stolen family assets to keep it from collapsing. She told him his greed had ruined his own daughter and destroyed his legacy. The judge sentenced Vincent to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. Furthermore, she signed a permanent binding injunction, barring him from ever holding a corporate executive position or sitting on a board of directors for the rest of his natural life. Vincent buried his face in his chained hands and began to sob loudly. His empire was dead, and he would die a disgraced and ruined man. Then the judge turned her attention to my son. She looked at Aaron and told him that his crimes were particularly heinous because they specifically targeted his own family. She detailed how he preyed upon a vulnerable woman recovering from surgery in a hospital bed. She explicitly stated that elder financial abuse and wire fraud are acts of profound cowardice and moral bankruptcy. Aaron stood up, his chains rattling loudly in the quiet room. He could barely keep his legs from giving out beneath him. The judge did not show him a single ounce of mercy. She sentenced Aaron to 12 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole. 12 years locked inside a concrete box. Aaron let out a small, choked gasp. He swayed on his feet, and his defense attorney had to grab his arm to keep him from collapsing to the floor. The prosecutor stood up and announced that the court would now hear the victim impact statement. I squeezed Diane's hand one last time and stood up from the wooden bench. I walked down the center aisle and took my place at the wooden podium facing the judge. I adjusted the microphone. The entire courtroom leaned in, waiting for a display of screaming anger or a tearful emotional breakdown. But I did not give them a show. I did not raise my voice or pound my fists on the podium. I spoke with a quiet, clinical precision that carried the heavy weight of absolute finality. I told the court that I was not there to ask for vengeance because vengeance is driven by emotion, and I had no emotion left for the man sitting at the defense table. I told the judge about the young boy I had raised. I described the child who used to help me wash the car on Sunday mornings and the teenager who promised to work hard and build an honest life. Then I described exactly how a slow, insidious greed had infected that boy. I explained how the desperate need to appear wealthy and the toxic desire for unearned status had completely rotted him from the inside out. I told the court that Aaron did not commit this crime out of necessity or survival. He committed it out of pure, unchecked arrogance. He wanted to buy the approval of a fake tycoon and a shallow bride, and he decided his mother's safety was the acceptable price of admission. I turned away from the judge and looked directly at Aaron. He slowly lifted his heavy head and met my gaze. His eyes were swimming with tears of profound regret. I spoke directly to him, letting my voice project clearly through the courtroom speakers. I told him he spent his entire life looking down on his parents. He thought we were small and pathetic because we lived in a modest suburban house and drove old, reliable cars. He was so desperate to sit at the big table that he forged medical documents to steal a piece of real estate just to impress a family of frauds. I paused and let the silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment, allowing the tension to fill every corner of the room. Then I delivered the final, crushing truth. I told Aaron that the holding company he tried to defraud, the massive corporate entity that owned the high-rise office buildings, the luxury shopping centers, and the sprawling industrial logistics parks, was entirely mine. I told him that I built that silent, invisible empire over 40 years, using discipline and discretion just to secure his future. I explained the ultimate devastating irony of his crime. I told him that every single asset, every commercial building, every massive bank account, and every piece of land was already placed in a trust with his name on it. Aaron stopped breathing. His eyes widened to an impossible degree. The tears stopped falling, completely replaced by a look of sheer, unimaginable horror. He stared at me as the massive weight of the truth finally crushed the last remaining pieces of his soul. I told him he did not need to forge a medical proxy to steal a summer house. He did not need to beg Vincent Gallagher for a fake corporate partnership. He was the sole heir to an actual billionaire empire. All he had to do to inherit the entire city was be a good son. I watched Aaron physically crumble under the realization of what his arrogance had cost him. The knowledge hit him like a physical blow. He had thrown away a multi-billion-dollar legacy for a bankrupt import company and a bride whose shoes were stained with mud. He had traded a kingdom for a prison cell. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The devastation was absolute and irreversible. I did not wait for him to find his words. I had said everything that needed to be said. I turned away from the microphone, stepped down from the wooden podium, and walked back to my wife. I did not look at him again. The late afternoon sun cast a long golden glow across the rolling hills of our new countryside estate. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine and lavender through the open terrace. I stood near the edge of the sprawling stone patio, taking in the sheer magnitude of the peace we had finally achieved. This was not the modest suburban house where we had spent 3 decades trying to teach our son the value of humility. That house was gone sold to a nice young couple who appreciated its quiet charm. This new sanctuary was something entirely different. It was a massive architectural masterpiece of natural stone and rich mahogany sitting on 50 acres of pristine private land. We built this fortress of solitude using the exact cash we liquidated from the complete seizure of Vincent Gallagher's commercial warehouses. Every single brick, every pane of glass, and every blade of grass was paid for by the dismantling of the arrogant empire that tried to destroy my wife. There was a profound, deeply satisfying irony in knowing that the greed which sought to ruin us actually financed our ultimate paradise. The estate was alive today, not with the tense, hushed whispers of corporate conspiracies or the sharp, arrogant demands of toxic relatives, but with genuine human warmth. We were hosting a small, intimate garden party to celebrate the turning of the season. There were no caterers trying to impress high society snobs. There were no flashy imported sports cars parked in the circular driveway. The people gathered on the manicured lawn were the few true friends we had cultivated over a lifetime of quiet loyalty. These were the people who never cared about what title I held or what kind of car I drove. They were the people who called us just to ask how we were doing when the news of the trial broke. I watched my attorney Pierce standing near the outdoor kitchen holding a plate of grilled vegetables and laughing deeply at a joke someone had just told. It was strange and wonderful to see him out of his severe tailored courtroom suits. Today he wore a simple linen shirt and comfortable trousers. He was no longer the sharp legal weapon I wielded to sever my son from my empire. Today he was just a trusted friend enjoying a warm summer evening. He caught my eye across the patio and raised his glass in a silent toast. He knew exactly what this gathering represented. He knew the immense emotional cost of the victory we had secured. I raised my own glass in return, silently thanking him for standing by my side when the entire foundation of my family was cracking beneath my feet. My gaze drifted slowly across the lawn until it found the true center of my universe. Diane was standing under the shade of a large oak tree surrounded by a small group of friends. She was absolutely radiant. She wore a flowing, elegant dress the color of soft ivory that caught the golden light of the setting sun. Her silver hair fell gracefully around her shoulders, and her eyes sparkled with a profound, unshakable joy. It had been nearly a year since the dark, rainy afternoon when she was violently pushed into the mud by a woman who thought wealth gave her the right to be cruel. It had been a year since our own flesh and blood laughed at her humiliation. The healing process had not been easy. There were long, quiet nights filled with grief for the son we had lost. But looking at her now, I knew she was completely healed. The heavy, suffocating shadow of our treacherous son and his abusive bride was entirely gone from her life. She was free. I listened to the sound of her laughter floating across the garden. It was a pure melodic sound that I had missed for a very long time. For years, we had walked on eggshells trying to accommodate the escalating demands and the silent judgments of a son who was poisoned by ambition. We had shrunk ourselves down to fit into the background of his arrogant narrative. We had tolerated the subtle disrespect and the blatant manipulations because we believed that unconditional parental love required infinite patience. We were wrong. Unconditional love does not mean offering yourself up as a sacrifice to a predator, even if that predator is your own child. Diane finally understood that. We both did. She no longer carried the guilt of a mother who felt she had somehow failed. She recognized that we gave our boy every tool he needed to build a beautiful life, and he chose to use those tools to forge his own chains. I stepped slightly away from the main gathering, moving toward the far edge of the stone terrace, where the property dropped off into a gentle slope overlooking the valley. The sky was beginning to turn deep shades of purple and brilliant orange. I swirled the dark red wine in my crystal glass, watching the liquid catch the fading light. The air was perfectly still. The frantic, chaotic noise of federal investigations, bankruptcy hearings, and dramatic boardroom confrontations felt like a distant, fading nightmare. My invisible empire was completely secure. The holding company was thriving, and the wealth I had spent a lifetime accumulating was safely protected in ironclad blind trusts destined for charities that actually deserved the support. I took a slow, deep breath of the clean country air. The adjustment I had put into motion all those months ago was finally complete. I thought about the nature of a family tree. When we plant the seeds of our lineage, we pour all our hope and our resources into the soil. We water the roots with our time, our sweat, and our endless devotion. We expect the branches to grow strong and reach toward the sun, but sometimes a sickness takes hold deep within the soil. Sometimes a rot begins to spread, corrupting the trunk and poisoning the leaves. If you leave the infected branches attached out of a misguided sense of loyalty, the sickness will eventually pull the entire tree down into the dirt. The rot will consume everything you worked so hard to build. I had to make the most agonizing choice a man can ever make. I had to take a sharp, heavy axe to my own family tree. I had to cut away the infected branch that was my son. I had to sever his toxic roots from my life before his greed and his arrogance could drag my wife and my legacy down into total ruin. It was a brutal amputation that left a deep scar on my heart. But standing here on this quiet patio, watching the sun sink below the horizon, I knew with absolute certainty that it was the only correct choice. The rot was gone. The infection had been completely removed. I took a slow sip of the rich red wine, feeling the warmth settle in my chest. I looked back toward the softly lit patio where Diane was smiling and holding the hands of her closest friends. The garden was perfectly safe. The walls of our new fortress were impenetrable. The old dead wood had been burned away, and the ashes were scattered to the wind. Now the rest of the tree could finally thrive in total, unbroken peace. The ultimate lesson here is that unconditional love does not require unconditional surrender. As parents, we naturally want to provide for and protect our children, shielding them from the world's harsh realities. However, when protection morphs into enabling, it can rot a person's character, replacing gratitude with blinding arrogance and greed. True love sometimes demands making the agonizing choice to cut the financial and emotional cords, allowing toxic family members to face the brutal consequences of their own actions. You cannot buy respect, and you must never sacrifice your own dignity, safety, or peace to fund someone else's delusion. If you have ever had to make the incredibly difficult choice to set boundaries or cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own peace, share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more tales of ultimate justice.